So continuing on consumption, um, we've certainly seen a shift toward processed foods, and that leads to increasing disconnection from food that most people experience. Again, we're in a little bit of a bubble here in Northern California. Things are a little bit different, but this is the kind of food that Jose Bove, a French farmer and activist that we've got some information up on the other part of the module, calls food from nowhere because there's no connection to any place. And so, what are our alternatives in dealing with this? Well, one is revaluing taste. So making taste a priority, the way things taste, not eating anything that's not delicious, not eating junk. Another is decommodifying your food. So in other words, not buying those kind of commodity products, have a garden, cook for yourself, eat lower down on that processed food chain. Maybe you refuse food based on certain criteria. um, Making time for food and the pleasures of the table. So there's an organization, Slow Food, that again, we've got other information there on the module, link to their website, which originally was an Italian socialist organization and now has kind of morphed into this quasi-activist, somewhat maybe elitist kind of food organization. But you should go and check them out for yourself. See, this is the problem, is that, doing things that are going to decommodify our food, it's expensive, they're pricey. And unless we can change this conversation somehow, this does become an elitist proposition, something that's only good for, wealthy people or people who have disposable income, or people who don't mind spending a little bit more money on food, which is hard to justify if you've got a couple of kids and only one of you maybe is working, and this is tough. But if we want to think about, we've talked about eating locally, eating organically. Some studies suggest that eating one meal per week locally produced would save a little over 1 million barrels of petroleum a week. And a barrel is 42 gallons. So, that's certainly something to think about. One thing we haven't defined is what is local. Now, in face-to-face classes, we often have a pretty lively discussion about what local might mean. Whether that's Mendocino County or Mendocino and Lake counties, whether that's Northern California, whether that's a 100-mile radius. Hard to say. Different people have different ideas about what local might be. I remember when I was a kid, we had lived in upstate New York and in a town called Oxford. And the next town over, which was, maybe 4 miles, 5 miles away, maybe less even, was called McDonough. And we were talking with one of the local dairy farmers and asking about his family and how he met his wife and etc. And said, oh, did you know her growing up? She's from around here. And he said, oh, no, she's not from around here at all. And we went, oh, wow, gosh, where's she from? And he says, she's from McDonough. So, for him, his frame of reference was almost literally his own farm. Obviously, I think most of us are a little bit different. But as far as the government's concerned, local does have a definition. 2008, Congress passed Resolution 2419, and that amended the Consolidated Farm and Rural Development Act. And local and regionally are kind of grouped together, meaning either the total distance that the product is transported is less than 400 miles from the origin of the product, or the state in which the product is produced. So, we could say we have local oranges from Sacramento, or local dates from around the Bakersfield area. I don't know, if that fits your definition of local. I don't really think it fits mine, but it's certainly better than, say, dates from Israel and oranges from Florida. Um, We also have talked about or thought about the best ways to affect change and whether or not voting with our fork is the most effective way. So, you know, certainly spending money that's consistent with your values is a very important step. But the problem is that we don't have a functioning free market system where being a consumer is enough to drive change. Um, you hear the term free market, basically meaning that the kind of buyers and sellers set the rules, that if people don't want to buy a product, it won't succeed. If they do, it will, etc. But we really don't have a free market system in this country, despite what people might want to say and despite what people might think. I've heard it described as the only true free market system was right after Hurricane Katrina. And people selling things for exorbitant prices and people buying them as being the only true free market we've really experienced here. Um, but in an idealized market system, the sellers of something, in this case food, would respond to consumers' buying decisions by providing what people want. So if people stop buying certain things, they'll produce less of that, etc. But this idealized system assumes a lot of things. One, including the free flow of accurate information, and two, a lot of sellers in competition with each other so that buyers can exercise choices. But if we look at the whole food system in this country, neither of those conditions are really met. For example, we've talked about GMOs, and there's labeling laws, and there's currently one, under consideration in the Senate. Um, Many Americans have indicated that they don't want to be consuming GMOs, but the reality is almost all of us are. And the reason is a lack of information. We're literally unaware of what's in our food. So we can avoid consuming GMOs through individual buying decisions. It's unlikely to affect the market unless millions of other people are making that same decision. And in order for those millions to make that decision, we have to have a way to provide them with the information they need through labeling campaigns, massive education drives, etc. Maybe a less well-known example might be sustainable livestock production. So a very significant portion of the price that's charged is because of the cost of processing meat at a small-scale slaughterhouse. If the regulations were changed so that they were scale appropriate, the slaughterhouse could charge less, ranchers could then charge customers less. And so that expense is limiting the number of people who buy this kind of food, right? So change the regulations, you benefit both the consumers who are already investing in quality food, so people who might be buying meat from the farmer's market, let's say, and bringing more people into that conversation because suddenly the price is a little bit more attractive. So voting with your dollar is important. Getting healthy food, nourishing your body, helping the farmers who are raising that food stay in business. But to really be effective, we need a lot more widespread change to make that happen. We also might need to really be rethinking the way that we're eating. David Pimentel, he's an expert on food and energy at Cornell in Ithaca, New York. It's estimated that if the entire world ate the way that we do, humanity would exhaust all known global fossil fuel reserves in just over 7 years. Now, he has his critics. Some people have accused him of being off by as much as 30%. Make that 10 years. Well, the truth is, what we call, somewhat patronizingly developing nations, they're certainly starting to adopt what we think of as a Western or American diet. Part of our other problem is that we have food everywhere, but not a lot to eat. So our biggest crop, grain corn, is completely unpalatable to humans. It's raw materials for industry that manufactures processed foods. You can't eat unprocessed wheat. Certainly can't eat hay. Can't eat unprocessed soybeans. Mostly we don't. But those four crops cover 82% of American cropland. So agriculture, as we've seen, is not about food. It's about commodities that require more energy to become food. And, we've examined a little bit about where this came from. One thing we haven't talked about is this kind of started with the Industrial Revolution, particularly in Victorian England. So the British Empire was flush with sugar from plantations in the colonies, right? We had that hideous triangle trade, slaves going to the cotton plantations, rum and molasses coming to the colonies. Um, Timber, other things for shipbuilding, heading back to England and in that triangle trade. But in the Industrial Revolution, we had all of this sugar. And the cities had a lot of factory workers, right? Factories were springing up, new processes were being invented, and there was really no good way to feed them. So thus was born the afternoon tea break, which is the tea at that point consisted primarily of warm water and sugar, probably some tea leaves too, because the British did have other colonies producing tea. And the workers were well off. They could also maybe afford some bread with some very heavily sugared jam. So this was sugar-powered industrialization. There was a 500% increase in per capita sugar consumption in Britain between 1860 and 1890, around the time when the life expectancy of a male factory worker was 17 years. By the end of the century, the average British person was getting about a sixth of his or her total nutrition from sugar, about the same percentage that Americans get today, which is about double what nutritionists recommend. So that's another piece of the puzzle of how we got here. Also thinking about consumption, if we leave aside the issue of animal rights for a moment, which I'm not trying to dismiss. It's certainly an important consideration for us ethically, morally. We haven't explored too much the ethical dimensions of what we're doing eating wise, and really just focusing on how things are produced, etc. The ethical and moral questions we'll probably bring up a little later in the semester, but they're certainly important ones. But if we leave that aside, vegetarians, which may have the moral high ground in terms of animal rights, might lose the edge in the energy argument by eating processed food with 10 calories of fossil energy for every calorie of food energy we produce. So question is, does eating processed food like a soy burger or soy milk cancel the energy benefits of vegetarianism? So or should we be better off eating lamb chops, right? If we're again if we're not considering the issue of animal rights or whether we should or shouldn't be eating other creatures, maybe, right? If I've done due diligence and I maybe found out that the lamb that I'm eating is both local and grass-fed, two factors that are going to greatly reduce the embedded energy in a meal. Some ranches here in Mendocino and Lake County, for instance, where sheep eat native grasses under closely controlled circumstances, no farming, no plows, no corn, no nitrogen. Assets haven't been stripped directly. Maybe these are on hillsides where other forms of agriculture are less possible. I can't eat the grass directly, but the lambs can. So again, something to think about. So last week, you were to track your budget, and I'll be interested to see what percentage of your household budget was going to food. I wonder if you know what percentage of the average U.S. household is going to food and on other countries, right? That would be, it's an interesting question. In the U.S., it's about 6%. In Britain, about 9%. France, about 14%. South Africa, 20%. Brazil, 25%. India, 35%. Kenya, 45%. And what we can see is that the poor spend a higher percentage of their income on food. So on one level, that's pretty intuitive. Food is a basic need, and there's only so much you can eat, no matter how much money you have. So if let's say we had a scale of rich to poor, 1 through 10, let's say, 10 being the richest, 1 being the poorest. And let's say we gave each of those people the same amount of food, and let's assume that this was, enough food nutritionally, calorically, etc., to meet their needs. Obviously, the percentage that's spent on that would be lower among the people who were the richest, right? So that's intuitive. But even among the developed countries, our food spending is ultra low. People in most European countries spend over 10% of their incomes on food. In fact, we spend less on food than any other country in the world. So this is not always the way it's been, though. As far back as when I was born, which admittedly is a bazillion years ago, but in 1963, so just a little after I was born, an employee of the Social Security Administration who was creating the nation's first poverty threshold, in other words, figuring out at what line people are considered to be living in poverty. She just tripled the cost of the FDA's Thrifty Food Plan, since at that time most families spent about a third, or 30%, of their income on food. So how'd we end up spending just a fraction of that so many, 4 or 5 decades later? Certainly part is increasing wealth. Part is, though, our insistence that food is something that should be or is cheap. Now, this is we're getting into the realm of economics, and how things should be priced, whether higher pricing is going to exclude the poorer members of our society, and if it does, what can we do to change that, to make sure that everybody in this country is being fed a nutritious and delicious diet. I do think one thing that is key is making that time for the pleasures of the table, and to eat with friends, eat with family, cook together, value your food, and to value yourself. I get it. I love a nice potato chip myself, and sometimes there's nothing better than just getting a bag of those and eating them. But that's, I don't think, how we were meant to live. Not to say there's anything wrong with having those kinds of foods, but do make time to be present with each other, with your food. Do make time, if you have children, to spend time cooking with them, eating with them. If you live with your parents, try to make time to have those family meals together, and to really think about and talk about and really analyze and get into what we're eating, and try eating more of a diet of whole and unprocessed foods. And I'll get off the soapbox now.